So, hello everyone, and thanks for being here. It's an honor for me just to present one of our latest work to monitor the COVID crisis using high resolution transaction data from BBVA, the second largest bank in Spain with presence in many other countries too. Okay, so the COVID pandemic has emerged the importance of using high frequency data to measure and track the impact of the virus spread as well as the lockdown measures implemented in most of the countries. Particularly, using transaction data from BBVA, we are going to collect all the payments done with credit and debit cards from a BBVA client, as well as all the payments collected by a BBVA point of sales to build a proxy of consumption in real time and high definition. Of course, one of the most important parts of the project is to check the robustness of our data for the analysis, assuring their quality and representativeness over the whole period. This is indeed the most time-consuming part of the project, where we put a special care to clean, transform, and test the data. Once we have it ready for the analysis, the potential is huge. We have been working during the last 2 years, more or less, in an ambitious project to measure national accounts in real time and high definition with this financial data coming from cards and bank accounts. From these projects, different applications arise, and today I'm going to present one of them. That is, as I told you before, using card spending for nowcasting aggregate consumption, as well as to make granular economic analysis with this type of data. We are going to use the developed indicators just to understand the adjustment expenditure during the crisis, for example, in the case of Spain. Okay, so let's move to that part and to the data. As I said before, we got all these transactions operated by BBVA point of sales and cards, avoiding, of course, the double counting. And we are going to monitor around 2 billion of transactions for the case of Spain, but also we are going to monitor other countries where the bank is based. Okay, most of the data and the graph that we are going to see in the presentation comes from a paper that we presented last summer in the NBR Institute, where the sample period goes from the beginning of January 2018 to the end of June 2020. Okay, but there are other graphs that we updated for the presentation to see the recent evolution. Okay, in this table, we collect the descriptive statistics in the case of Spain, and here you have the detail of our data. We have, apart from these 2 billion of transactions, we have 6 million of cardholders with information about their home postal code, education level, and age. It is important to notice, as I told you before, that we have also data for Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, South US, and Turkey, that are the other countries in which BBVA operates. After testing that the BBVA expenditure is a coincident indicator and a valid proxy for consumption, both at the aggregate and at the micro level, here you have the details and also the link to the paper where we try it. We are going just to highlight, let me give just 2 points about the main advantage of using these built indicators. First of all, is the time advantage. So here you can see in this graph that our data is in real time, so we can have like fast and timely answer to the evolution of expenditure, getting the data before 1 and 3 months ahead than the release of the official data. This time advantage is especially important in emerging economies where official data is more scarce, okay? But moreover, this transaction data has a great detail that is not available in the official figures, like consumption by category or by geography, or even we can exploit other features like the disaggregation of virtual and physical point of sales, if we want to monitor e-commerce, the information about ATM withdrawals as a proxy of the use of cash, or if the payments are done with a national or a foreign card. Okay, so these small graphs below are some examples about it for the case of Spain. Okay, so once we have cleared the data, let's go to analyze the results. We present here a global overview of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on expenditure patterns across countries. For each of these countries, we aggregate all transactions to construct some synthetic indicators, okay? So here we can see the monthly evolution of the indicator, which reflects the impact of the crisis, the pandemic, and also the recovery that was uneven depending on the country. If we go just to have everything together in order to compare the evolution among countries, here you have also the information with more detail. Here the information is on daily frequency, and we compute like the moving average 14 days and year-on-year growth rates, presenting this data in percentage points deviation from the pre-COVID period, in order to take into account that the data is nominal and different countries experience different inflation rates, okay? So they should be interpreted, the data here, as the total percentage point decline in year-on-year growth relative to the growth that they have in the period before the crisis, okay, so before March. From this global picture, we observe a cross-country heterogeneous impact of the pandemic. There was a large and fast decline in global expenditure at mid-March, as we can observe here, in most of the geography, and then a global recovery since the end of April. However, the speed of recovery was really different by country. It seems that the slowest recoveries were in Argentina and Colombia. Peru, however, was one of the most hit economies, but the recovery was really stable over time until the recent period, because they have again a slowdown of the economy given the lockdown of the country. Okay, so in the case of Spain, the improving trend, we can see that was better when the easing of the measure of the lockdowns started, okay? So the information that we have from the cross-country heterogeneous impact of the pandemic show us that it was uneven across countries, and also it is associated with the lockdown measures imposed by government. So that is, there are important policy implications in the evolution of consumption. In the Spanish case that you can see here in this slide, you can see like the week ahead of the lockdown, there was an increase of expenditure in anticipation to it. And then we have the sudden decline of 60 percentage points in the series that was at mid-March, and then it remained depressed until the early May, when the lockdown measures were partially relaxed, okay? So the easing restrictions has a really important relation with the evolution of consumption. So here we can study it more in detail. Here we saw like the easing restrictions in these phases comparing with because here it is important just to highlight, sorry, that the easing of the restrictions was not equal in all the geographies, in all the regions in Spain. So what we are doing in the paper is just to have this into account in order to exploit the differential timing in the intensity of the easing across provinces, okay? So here we saw some even study graphs centered around the dates with some provinces further ease into different phases, okay? So the plots, so the year-on-year expenditure growth For provinces which is into phase 1, 2, or 3, again, those provinces that stayed in the more restrictive phase. Okay, so there is evidence of different expenditure paths of provinces is in lockdown relative to those that do not. The differential recovery pattern is particularly evident for phase 1 and 2, as you can see in the first two graphs. We did some regressions just to prove this statement, and indeed, the results show that phase 1 and phase 2 contribute most to the strong recovery. Okay, so we also exploit, like in this time span, the evolution of expenditure by category. We have, according to our data, 76 different categories of consumptions, and we exploit the relationship with income. So in this table, we compute the share in each of these 76 categories we have across Madrid postal codes, and then correlates with the individual categories with data of income per capita for the household budget survey. Okay, and here you see how this income affects consumption. Okay, so higher income postal codes are associated with more spending in restaurants, health, and well-being, as well as travel and time-efficient transportation like taxis or parking slots. Okay. However, lower income postal codes are associated with spending on essential goods related with food and the household care, and also with the consumption of tobacco. This provides some insights on how differences in income translate into trade-offs between time and money, investment in personal health, as well as the access to leisure. Okay, so going now to the study of the expenditure reallocation given the crisis, we analyze the chain of expenditure patterns across countries during the study period, okay? So we observe here that the consumption share are quite stable until the week preceding the national lockdown, when a clear reallocation pattern emerged. Spending in food and hypermarkets grew significantly, supposedly over the half of all the expenditure by late March. And at the same time, other sectors like fashion and leisure collapse. Once the restriction is, the composition of consumption returns gradually to the previous distribution. Even nowadays, we have the food expenditure is still increasing, and among the most stagnant categories, we have the expenditure in travel and accommodation. Okay? We also study how these spending patterns have been affected during the lockdown to different groups in Madrid postal codes. So here you can see the aggregate evolution of expenditure by postal code group in 5 average income quintiles. Okay, so this we have the evolution in the first graph in absolute level and then in year-on-year growth. And results show that apart from the common dynamics observed in the rest of Spain and commented before, different groups of income were affected differently. The fall in expenditure in larger and richer neighborhoods that was higher than in the poorer ones. The reason of it is that restrictions affected more to the pattern of consumption of rich people, moving away from luxury goods to the most essential ones. So the recovery affects more or less in the same manner to the rest. Okay, so on the other hand, given the importance of mobility patterns during the crisis, the COVID pandemic, we also built an expenditure-based mobility proxy using BBVA spending categories related to transportation. So that is, when individuals spend money on these categories, they do so because they want to move. So comparing with Google mobility data, we found a very tight relationship between the two series. During the lockdown, also the two cities started to diverge somewhat during the easing restrictions. Since card spending on transportation tracks mobility during the lockdown in the aggregate really well, we use it to explore the heterogeneity across Madrid postal code in mobility, okay? So in the second graph, you can see how these transportation spending reductions during the lockdown are significantly lower for clients living in the lowest decile postal codes by income per capita. So that is, you see here that the differences between the highest decile and the lowest decile in their mobility, because probably, and especially during the working days, we see that these differences are bigger, suggesting that mobility differences across income groups arise because of preference, because of work, that is, okay? So disaggregating further this expenditure across transport groups, we found that higher income households decreased significantly their share of spending in public transport, but not the lowest income decile. And this is a result that we want to study more in depth, because this lower income household travel more during the lockdown, but also they do it in more risky method of transport. Okay, so for this, another question arises, and is, are lower income population relative most exposed to infection? So we ran a simple regression just to see how these mobility patterns impact disease testing for other variables too, apart from this urban spending data. And results show that actually, this variable is really significant. So it supports the idea that traveling in Madrid during the epidemic increased the probability of infection. So how much COVID-19 cases in lower income households would fall in the case of the lowest expenditure people spent in transport the same as the high decile? So here you have the result in this second graph, and it suggests that actually there is an important percentage reduction in the cases of infected people for this lowest decile. Okay, so this is important just to highlight that the evolution of this epidemic and monitor this granular data is really important, just to see how these COVID crises are evolving and how they can be reduced significantly. Okay, so just before going to the conclusions, in these 10 minutes, just let me briefly say that we have really granular data that we are publishing in our website, where you can see the evolution of the indicators on daily basis. We update it every week, and we have it for all the countries. We have it for every sector and category of consumption. And moreover, we have the information by e-commerce comparing with physical expenditure, which is really interesting just to see how these digitization trends are increasing by country. We can also disentangle between foreign expenditure that remains stagnant comparing with the national expenditure. Just to highlight by sector of activities, tourist-related sectors, in the case of Spain, continues to be the most affected ones. This is updated data. You have also a great detail by provinces, where you can see that the impact of the first wave of the epidemic was much more higher than the second and the third one. And also, just to take into account that for studying this consumption dynamics, it's important to study the country, but also the relationships between countries, because they emerge some important conclusions to take into account. In our webpage, you can also find a recent report where we analyze this consumption data comparing with mobility and also with energy data, so we can have a broader and comprehensive image about what is happening in the economy using high frequency data. And just to conclude, let me say that this analysis shows us the usefulness of this transaction data to assess economic conditions, capturing relevant patterns in spending in real time and in high definition. And this is particularly useful for emerging countries, for policymakers and researchers, okay? So the impact of this COVID crisis on expenditure, we can study it in detail with this granular data, how was the initial shock, the recovery, and also we test this data to construct some mobility indicators using transport expenditure that seems to be relevant for monitoring just other policy making things that could be done using this data. And with it, thank you so much. And I'm happy to hear all your questions.
Thank you very much, Tomasa. It was really great to hear the story of how you've looked at that data through the lens of COVID. We have a question here from Rohan Naik, and he asks, which data warehouse platform did you use to store and analyze the transaction data, because it's very high volume? And which modeling language and platform have you used to perform the analysis?
Perfect. Okay, we have a house cloud infrastructure, okay, and we are using our own cloud, and we are using Spark and Python for working with the data, especially PySpark, because processing the data, you need to do it in parallel, actually, because it is really heavy, that's true. And then we also done some analysis in Python using pandas.
Fantastic. And how many people in your team were working on this project, Tomasa, just to understand?
We are about 16 people.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, I'm just checking that there's no more questions on the chat. If anybody does have any questions later on for Tomasa and you'd like to